This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Okay, and we are back in the dark room. I'm Brad Kelly. This is my co-host Kevin Kautzman. We're matching today, kind of.
Black.
Yeah,
black on black on black. None more black.
It is the Art of Darkness, right?
It is Art of Darkness. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that is our guest Ross Benjamin. Before we launch into that, I just want to say we're very excited to do this episode. There's some chatter already in our Telegram channel, t.me/artofdarkpod. I know some folks in there have bought the Kafka Diaries and are reading them, and there's enthusiasm in there. So I know there's going to be a bunch of people listening to this who are sort of with the book next to them. It's a beautiful edition. It is an
extremely handsome volume as a bibliophile.
Cover designer Peter Mendelssohn.
Okay.
The Kafka library, they share motifs, but he uses the motifs very differently from book to book in the Shokin Kafka library, Peter Mendelssohn.
Yeah, I've seen the style in some of the other volumes. I don't actually, this is the only one I have, I think, by him. I think I had my whole Kafka library before, but
it's a book as an object that when you get it, you know you have it. It's precious. It's heavy.
When I got it, it was because I'd seen the thumbnail of it, which if you look on Amazon, it looks like an amazing graphic, but something about the paper like texture and the I'm not good with that.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
The exact quality of the color. Just when I first opened the box, it was also I already
must have
thumbnail, and then it was
okay.
Very
We're gonna get into. Let me introduce the crowd to you, and that's okay. This is great. We're joined today by Ross Benjamin. Ross Benjamin is the translator of the newly released, hot off the presses Kafka Diaries. This is a project for which he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. His other translations include Frederick Holderman's Hyperion, Joseph Roth's Job, Daniel Kellman's You Should Have Left, and Tile. Am I pronouncing that right?
Till, actually.
Till, okay.
It's with a Y, so I can see how you could.
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure. Okay, I clearly haven't read it either. And was awarded the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize for his rendering of Michael Marr's Speak Nabokov. You can learn more about Ross at rossmbenjamin.com. And Ross, before we get into it, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And also just thanks, even if we never got to talk to you, thanks for doing this book.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is awesome. What
hang on.
has
Hang on 1 second. Ross, yes, I second this.
Yeah.
I was looking at the handwriting that you're dealing with. And of course, you're dealing with an existing translation and then also the executor of his literary estate. What was that fellow's name again?
Max Brod. Yeah.
Brod. When I cracked this open and I read your introduction, all I could think was how much labor must have gone into this. Yeah. So yes, thank you.
But just to be fair, I didn't have to transcribe the handwriting. There was a German edition that did that.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah. So
fair enough.
Yeah,
still the translation job is just staggering. Yeah.
And this was a 7 or 8 year process, is my understanding. This translation.
It from start to finish, it was 8 years. I mean, there was time in there where it was with an editor and I could do other things and managed to translate a couple of other books. But certainly, if I hadn't been doing it, I would have done probably many other things because it was pretty consuming over those 8 years. But it wasn't like I worked on it every single day for those 8 years. But it's still most of that time, most work days in those 8 years, I was plugging away at Kafka's Diaries.
Wow, that's certainly
plugging away is even the right word. It was more like sort of circling in the vortex of it.
Yeah. What's it like being in old Franz's head, his old noggin for 7 or 8 years?
It's like I don't even know if that was the source of my my situation really mirrored in a way Kafka's psyche in that nothing was ever certain. I could always circle back and start again, and I could never make progress. There was a kind of paralyzing doubt and anxiety that was very reminiscent of Kafka's psyche, but I don't think it's quite because of the sort of mind meld of translation, but rather just because it is so difficult to translate, that translating Kafka just happens to be one of those types of experiences that he also describes so much in his fiction, where there's really no handhold or foothold, no hold.
Yeah. Well, and I think for people to kind of understand that, tell us a little bit about what your translation philosophy was, because there was previous English editions of the diaries and these are very different. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a long saga, in fact, and I'll try to condense it as well as I can. But when it starts really with Kafka's death in 1924, he was 40 years old. I know you've covered this in other episodes, the biography. He died of complications of tuberculosis, laryngeal tuberculosis, at 40. And he had left in charge of his literary estate, his unpublished writings and manuscripts, his closest friend, Max Brod. Literary executor is now the title that Brod famously holds, even though in his lifetime, Brod himself was a really prolific writer, far more prolific than Kafka, and far more of a sort of operator on the literary scene. So Kafka had left actually more than one letter, I think, but his last testament to Brod stated that he wanted Brod to burn all of his unpublished, to collect first and then burn his unpublished manuscripts, diaries, letters. They were in different places. He'd given his diaries to Milena, one of his later loves of his life. Letters were with their recipients and so on. And he wanted Brod to destroy them. Brod, almost immediately after his death, set about doing the opposite and publishing them. In publishing them, however, he took considerable liberties in editing the text as he saw fit, which was often pretty heavily, in order to make it appear much more coherent, cohesive, and polished than it was, because these were unfinished manuscripts with all of their disarray and missing punctuation, misspelling, contractions, mistakes, things out of sequence, and so on. And he imposed a kind of orderliness and tidiness on the text. And then he also censored in the letters and diaries things that he found to be compromising or unflattering to Kafka, to himself, to others. And this process went on over decades. So, he started with the unpublished novels, and those really hurtled Kafka to a level of, worldwide renown that he hadn't had in his lifetime. He'd had a kind of limited and enthusiastic readership among other prominent literary and cultural figures, but not as much of nothing like what he experienced after his death. As a result, probably, of the publication of these, of the Trial, the Castle, America, these great unfinished novels that Brode published in somewhat manipulated fashion. And then later he started to publish the kind of what you would think of as the more autobiographical writings, even though it's complex, but the letters and diaries and so on. Yeah. And the diaries in particular, because it's the most intimate writing, he censored things that seemed all too revealing of aspects of Kafka that he found threatening to the image of Kafka he was promoting in the public mind. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And, I think about Max Brode sometimes because he does seem like a guy, he's sort of a literary ethics thought experiment a little bit, right? It's sort of like, well, should he have burned all the stuff like Kafka asked? Well, I'm glad he didn't. Okay, should he have manipulated the diaries? Well, probably not. But also, I find myself sort of all over the map with Max Brode to the extent that I understand what he did.
I guess I could never really wish to take it all back, and but I could probably wish that he made the decision to publish it with a bit more ambivalence, a bit less ambivalence, or a bit, if he owned the decision more by really publishing what was there, or that he was at least more transparent about what he was doing. Because that was the other issue where, his edition of the diaries, the introduction says, like, this is almost as complete an edition as could be imagined. And
if you put that label on that, then that's deceitful, right?
People publish their loved ones' diaries who have literary claim, and sometimes they'll say in the forward, I've taken out things I found too personal, or that I didn't want people to know about my loved one.
Right.
Didn't say that. He even insisted on, I left in everything that you can see how faithful I was, because I left in even things that are unflattering to me, which is a half-truth, because he left in some things that were unflattering to him that obviously he could tolerate, and he cut things that were really that really got to him, that were unflattering to him, that really wounded him. He just cut them because he
interesting,
too damaging to the reputation.
Well, and what were some of these things that he cut?
So his own the one that I'm thinking of now that was unflattering to him in a way that he couldn't tolerate was a reference to a review of a reading he'd given, I think it was in Berlin, of his own poetry or his own writing, and then also the poems of Franz Werfel, who was at that time a rising star. And the review sort of snarkily said that he had read the far more significant Werfel, and that he had been selfless in reading this, much better writer. And it had a few other little jibes at him, but the rest of it could have been read as a roughly positive review. So Brode brought that review to the Prague daily newspaper to have it reprinted, and cut those phrases.
Oh, nice! Love it.
That were wounding to him. And this was also, the reviewer was somebody he went on to have like a lifelong feud with. Like, I think he mentions it in his autobiography, how wounded he was by this review. The circle of people that this reviewer was with in the literary scene had all just recently kind of parted ways with Brode, and they were starting to no longer be so affectionate toward each other. And so it was this whole kind of, psychodrama. And so he cut those lines, and then Kafka noted in his diaries precisely that. It's a diary entry about Brode being censorious of that review. And then that's the diary entry that Brode went and tampered with in the exact same way, cutting the parts that referred to that and leaving in the rest of the entry. So it's humorous, and it's sort of petty.
It's a one lie. You got to keep that one. Sometimes you tell one lie, and you end up having to keep covering.
I think it's also just that his feelings were so hurt by that he left in stuff that maybe he felt was unflattering, but it reflected well on him that he left it in,
Right.
as opposed to what was unflattering, but just made him look, not
in a
not
particular way. But
this
I
is
did
the
notice,
sign. Hang on, Brett. This is the sign of a vital literary scene. And
Right.
we're trying to do something. We're trying to start some podcast feuds, but we'll leave that aside for now. This is good. This is a good thing. All of this, Jews.
But just to put the final touch on this background that people might need is that that edition of the diaries that Brode had tampered with, and the other kind of stuff he cut were, and we could get into it later, were like lewder things that made Kafka seem like more lascivious. Maybe he left in certain types of sexual stuff, but not the stuff that was particularly graphic or lewd. And then homoerotic stuff, he sort of cut across the board. Anything that suggested Kafka's desire for male bodies, of which there are a number of examples. And then he maybe what is the most, what had the greatest impact in making his edition such a misrepresentation of what was in the diaries, is he really diminished the sort of literary richness of all the drafts and redrafts and rewriting of literary pieces in the diaries, where Kafka would start the same piece of writing dozens of times and write different variations of it, and it was rough and all over the place, and he would create composites and kind of create cohesive seamless stories out of these fragments that were far more various and multifarious than what he put in. And then he took out like wholesale Kafka's rough drafts of works that were published elsewhere, either in his lifetime or that Brode published elsewhere as posthumous writings that could be considered works of fiction or literary works, but were written in the diaries. And so that edition served as the basis of the English translation that we had until my translation. He prepared that German manuscript, and then the English translators translated it in 1948-49, and that's actually what came out. It came out before the German one, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, close to the same time in the late 40s. And it led to another quirk of literary history, which was that at that time, Hannah Arendt was the editorial director of Schoken Books, where this was all happening. Both the German and the English editions were under the aegis of the same publisher that had offices in Palestine, later Israel, or at that time Israel, and New York, and published works in German and in English. And she was the editorial director of the New York office that published the English edition. She worked with these translators, and she noticed that Brode had cut some of these literary drafts from when she looked at the original typescripts, and she put some back in, just like not all of them, which was interesting. Maybe she didn't want to step on his toes too much, or maybe she didn't go through the whole thing as thoroughly. But at the beginning, Brode had cut down this one piece that Kafka rewrites like 11 times to just 4 versions, and she put back in the other ones. And so there was this odd thing where for decades, German scholars of Kafka had access to more of the diaries in the English translation than they did in the German edition.
Interesting.
9.
And only after Brode's death did they see, the whole thing, that there was in both the English and the German editions, there were huge swaths of text missing and important facets of Kafka's, personality and life and work.
That's really interesting. I mean, there is a certain I could see, I never read the it's one piece of Kafka material I had never really read was the first English translation, and I guess I could see there being some virtue to like an optimized version, right? I think this is clearly better, partially because of the thing you're talking about in your intro. You refer to wanting to maintain or present something like the writer's workshop, like Kafka's workshop in book form. And I think it definitely accomplishes that. I mean, you're certainly and partially accomplished by leaving everything in there. So you see the notes. There's one story I quite like about he's approached by this gentleman who is sort of seeking legal advice about he had given this this essay he'd written to somebody, and then he thought that it showed up in the I guess it's the newspaper like the next day.
He thought he'd been plagiarized, but it becomes clear he's just absolutely off his rocker.
Yeah, he's just nuts. And it's a very Kafka-esque story too. Like it's I wouldn't have been surprised to see a slightly polished version of that in the collected short stories of Franz Kafka, right? By any means. Yeah. But in the middle of it, it's like he writes it out over the course of 2 or 3 days. And so you've got like notes that don't have anything to do with it in between them.
Yeah, intervening entries are always interesting in this respect. There's another great example, which is this text he wrote. He started to sort of compose what seems like an essay about the literature of small nations, about Yiddish literature and Czech literature, and some of the advantages in contrast to German literature, because he writes in German and he lived in this multilingual environment and he came into contact with Yiddish actors and became interested in these other literature, small literatures, he calls them. And he seems to be composing this essay, but there are intervening entries. And you can see that it's a pretty fractured text. And maybe when he comes back to it, he's actually saying something different from what he was saying when he first started it and so on. And Broad had presented that in his older edition as a composite that looked much more like a kind of continuous essay that then just breaks off, it being, that's incomplete. But it might be because of that scholars then picked up on that, and there's like a whole book by Deleuze and Guattari called Toward a Minor Literature, a whole interpretive work that kind of takes off from this text. And I almost wonder if that work would have existed if this composite text hadn't existed.
Oh, interesting.
Because they treat it, they do other things, and they're clearly doing a kind of creative misinterpretation anyway. Like there's a lot of scholars have taken issue with this treatment, this monograph, but also, I just wonder if they would have approached it differently if they'd seen it in its disarray and just how semi-articulated it was. There's so much rich material in it as it is, but it just seems much more self-contradictory and discontinuous.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense to be in. We were actually talking about this, or I was talking about this in something I was on the other day about seeing. I've spent a fair amount of time in literary archives, and Kevin has too, and seeing the mess that writers make on their way to making stuff is always incribly illuminating,
edifying, and helpful for writers.
In the midst of this project, I met a writer who lives near me, and he's one of my favorite writers, David Means, and as we became closer, he started to share his work with me in progress. And that probably helped me a lot, sort of to validate my sense that this is, an authentic approach or something. Because he even reassured me at times where I was like, it's such a mess or whatever. And I'm trying to embrace the mess, but it's really hard to navigate. And he would just like pull out a notebook and show me what the inside of his notebook looks like and be like, no, that's what you're doing as a writer. Like, so that was really affirming.
Sure. And there can be there can be doodles, there can be all kinds of things. There
are drawings in here that are reproduced.
Is there any? And I didn't quite see any. Was there any like? This is maybe a silly question, but was there any like grocery list type stuff? Was there anything that was just like?
It would have been fun if there was a little more. There's one thing at least that I can think of off the top of my head, which is where he notes down a couple debts that he owes, which of course Broad had left out. Why would he leave it in when he's presenting the work the way he was? And leaving it in, the main virtue of leaving it in is it gives readers that feel that these are a notebook, where he's just jotting things down, because of course they are looking at it in book form, and to sort of remind them of why it is this way. It's a notebook. It's nice to have this little jotting. So he just said like, I owe this many Cronin and this many Hellers to these two people. I noted it down, and
a writer who has debts, right? Nothing changes.
Very small debts, actually.
Oh, well, good. Good for Franz. Well, we've already touched on what we're going to talk about on the After Dark. I think we're going to get into a little more of the salacious sort of the business around sex and what Broad censored. That's going to be for Patreon members at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. So we'll tag on a little mini episode at the end of this with Ross. I'm excited for that. That was very interesting, and you pointed it out in the introduction as a kind of an important aspect of your work and what it means to restore this. I was going to say, for better or worse, often for worse, I am a theater guy, Ross, and I was struck in my perusing the book and reading through some of it by how much reference to the stage there is and the theater.
Absolutely.
I think I could have known, I somewhere subliminally, maybe I knew subconsciously that Franz would have been influenced by the theater, but it was really there. And he's like recounting the entire plots of plays beat for beat.
Yeah, in his review of this translation, Dwight Garner said he could have moonlighted as a theater critic.
Mm.
Kafka could have moonlighted as a
Yeah.
theater
That doesn't
critic.
surprise me.
Yeah.
There is, that's interesting. And of course that has to filter down into his writing. And
his
there
writing's
is
so theatrical when you think about it. There's so much gesture and physical comedy and just physical strangeness and description of scenography in his work. The father standing up on the bed in the Judgment and towering over the sun, or people crawling into bed with their lawyer or whatever.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely stuff that works in that context.
Yeah. The Metamorphosis is kind of a surrealist. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's kind of like a chamber play.
That's true, right? Taking place in this confined apartment, and the spatiality of his work. And in particular, the plays he describes, you can see precursors of some of his figures. Like he describes these two characters in kaftans in this Yiddish play that he sees, and the way that they're kind of always in the background, goofing around or making funny errors and playing certain pivotal roles in the action too, or coming in and out of the action. And then he has characters like this in the castle, these two assistants. That really seem to resemble these characters he's writing about it when he's viewing the Yiddish plays.
He has a prolonged. One thing I was on the lookout for as I'm reading through this, and I haven't been able to read the whole thing because it is a big book, but I'm going to get there eventually.
The kind of thing you can dip in and out of.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing is I feel like this is something I can just read a few pages of, right?
Right. It almost feels like you could do divination with this book. Like if you're a tortured writer, just open this up at random and see what's there for you.
I've had that.
I don't mean to derail things, but I did from time to time end up translating an entry that happened about 100 years before the day I was translating it, or before my birthday that year, because of the 100-year sort of span between these diaries being kept between 1909 and 1923, and then I was translating them between roughly 2014 to 2023.
Right.
So it would be like
kind of the centennial, sort of. I mean,
it's a centennial of the diaries for sure. Next year's a centennial of his dad. But I knew that sometime, as long as I got it out by 2023, which I did just under the wire, and I never thought it would take that long. But as long as I said to myself, and it was kind of a joke because I thought I'd get it out long before that. As long as I get it out by 2023, it'll be a centennial. But so that would happen though, where I'd be like, well, what does this mean that this entry was written 100 years ago on my birthday, like today?
That's pretty cool. Well, there's certainly, that would probably mean something to Kafka, I think, right? I think he would be the kind of guy who would take note of that, at least.
There's a page in the diaries where he's taking note of how the names and the Judgment, the initials or the number of letters in the names reflect people in his life and so on.
It was like a gematria kind of a thing. Yeah. Very cool. Ross, I got to ask, are you like a hot property now among Kafka scholars? Are you hearing from people like what is that like?
Well, that's good. I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah. Okay.
I would never probably refer to myself as a hot property in any situation, and I don't think I am among Kafka scholars in particular. But I was concerned that I might offend the sensibilities of Kafka scholars or fail to measure up to what they would hope for from something like this. And I do have the impression that Kafka scholars are generally felt that it was overdue for there to be an English version of, the German edition that did restore the text and, take away all of Broad's intervening or meddling, intrusions. That edition came out in 1990. So there was a kind of, I don't know if I could call it a clamor, but within the circle of Kafka scholars, there was this waiting and this sense that it was long overdue. And, I guess the first hurdle I wanted to clear would be that the scholars didn't reject my translation, and I've gotten positive
Right.
feedback from them. So from those scholars I've heard from or been in touch with,
Right.
and there were people I also inquired with early in the process about framing it, about, I had questions about the diaries before I undertook it, even when I was writing the proposal. So I had some communication, some back and forth. So I've gotten that positive feedback. That was kind of the first hurdle I wanted to clear. But I think I wouldn't have been satisfied if sort of the Kafka community alone had been interested in this book. And there was no guarantee, to me at least, or there was no way of knowing for sure that ordinary readers or ordinary lovers of Kafka too would be interested in seeing this version and this Kafka. And so to the extent that I've seen, a disproportionately positive response among readers on social media and people I encounter at events that I do, that's been immensely satisfying. That sometimes people would ask me doubtfully, well, who's going to read this?
Right.
When I was working it for all those years and it was kind of sucking some air out of my career, they would say, well, who are the readers of the Kafka Diary? And I'd say, well, I'd hope it would be people like when I discovered Kafka, when I wasn't destined to be a German translator. I had no professional interest in Kafka at the time I discovered him. And I read the diaries when I was a teenager in the old edition in English. And I'd hope that people like that are still out there. And by having this book finally out in the world, it's confirmed for me that they are, that there are still plenty of people like that out there. And that's basically scratches the itch completely for me.
Yeah. They definitely are out there. And I don't know if it's just the particular silo that I am in on Twitter, but I feel like half of my mutuals have bought this book or
I don't even care if it's
excited
I
about
don't know,
it.
as long as it's like, I don't care if it's marginal or if it's a niche, as long as it's more than just people who have a professional interest. As much as I admire the people who have spent their lives devoted to Kafka and want their approval, absolutely, and would feel disappointed if they were disapproving. I'm just glad that there's, however small, a corner of the world it is, that there is a corner of the world, of the reading world, that still has is still just as excited about this as I have been as a reader long before I had any professional stake in it.
Yeah. To me, it feels like there may be no competition for another writer whose diaries would be more interesting. Like, to me, it's clearly interesting as somebody who's been into Kafka since I sort of got into literature of any kind. But I think there is enthusiasm. I think people are very interested at this look inside of his head. Why do you think that is? I mean, I'm sure you know why you're interested in Kafka. Why do you think there is, at his centennial, there seems to be as much enthusiasm about this admittedly kind of odd, unusual writer, right? Why do people care about him still, in your opinion?
Yeah, in some ways it seems so evident to me that then it's hard to articulate because, but just to kind of add to that, to your question before I attempt a sketch of an answer, maybe, why is it that there's so few objectors to the love that Kafka's received, in his after his death? Like I found, there's an Edmund Wilson sort of dissent to the at the very beginning of the Kafka Vogue, or what he thought of as a Vogue for Kafka, where it's like a dissent. I think it's even titled like a dissenting opinion on Franz Kafka or whatever. So there's here and there in literary history, there's maybe a sprinkling of people, but it seems like Kafka's been so widely embraced across disciplines in academia and by ordinary readers and writers and artists in particular. And I mean, I think some of the simplest explanations are just the sheer, fertility of his imagination and invention. And who else can you think of who's really created things that were so distinctive and compelling? I mean, maybe I'm just restating the question now and the answer. Why is that so compelling and distinctive? his strangeness has always been a feature more than a bug, or maybe I shouldn't say
Yeah.
bug.
I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
what's the German word? What's the famous German word?
Ungeziefer. Yeah.
Ungeziefer. Yeah,
Yeah,
genau.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, for bug, it would be Avanza, or yeah, but that's not the word he uses. It is the word he used in his everyday colloquial speech when he talked about the metamorphosis. Apparently, he called it his Wanzengeschichte, his bug story.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I think his strangeness has always been part of the appeal. There is the appeal of the image that I kind of take issue with in my introduction, and that I'm somewhat positioning my translation as an intervention in, which is this sanctification of Kafka after his death as a kind of martyr to literature and a kind of literary saint that, he had and still has, even because somebody was saying to me, nobody's really moved the needle on sanctification. Like, no matter what you sort of expose about Kafka as a flesh and blood human, who made spelling errors and so on, we're going to revere him as a kind of literary saint. And so there's that sense of him as this authentic, tortured artist that is a myth, but also reflects something about his literary voice and his devotion and agony, as a creator, that I think is really appealing for other artists and anyone engaged in any sort of creative struggle that isn't just that don't have complete ease and fluidity to their his modernity, his sort of the fact that he's never ceased to be dealing with themes that are quintessentially modern. He's one of the first to really, whose work really centered around such themes, and these themes have continued to be just as salient, just as relevant.
Yeah, we sort of have made the point in some of our conversations about Kafka that for all of the talk of, say, 1984 being prescient or Brave New World being prescient, to me it feels like Kafka was not necessarily in the sort of pieces that he put on the board plot-wise or premise-wise, but just in how it feels to be living, right? That he seemed to capture that. And so to me, whenever I read it, it feels like, yeah, you could write this basically right now.
Well, he has there's a great paragraph in the diaries where he is dictating a letter to one of the typists, and he finally finds the word, and he's just so overcome with disgust at his talents being used this way.
Right.
And if that's
a piece of his flesh, so by finding this, by using his literary, whatever it is, by exploiting his literary skills for this office work, for this
banality.
He's robbed his body of a piece of its flesh. Yeah, and that's the word that he was seeking, is the piece of his flesh, I guess.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
This brings me to a question. I was just curious kind of what your thoughts on it, because he talks about writing as well. What was writing to Kafka? What do you think it meant to him? The act of it, the project of it. What was it for him?
Part of the origin of sort of the saint myth is that I think for him, he really seemed to treat it as a kind of salvation. But that's the sort of, that's one piece of it. I mean, another piece of it was, it's so complicated, I guess, but he writes a lot about writing and about what it is to him. He says things like, "I'm nothing but literature," or he says, as soon as I realized that I had some kind of, what does he say, that I had this penchant for depicting my dreamlike inner life. That's the exact quote. Well, from my translation.
Right.
That as soon as I realized I had this, because I had such limited energies on the whole, they all thronged to this one area of literature and atrophied in every other direction. So that's why I don't have enough energy to really actualize myself as an office worker, as a domestic spouse, because he was so conflicted about getting married, he's starting and breaking off engagements and affairs. That he only he had the sense of himself as not having quite enough vitality or virility to do more than serve kind of his literary gift. So yeah, I'm getting a little lost here, but it's
no, that's all right. Would you mind if I read just a little bit? Because I think I have.
Yeah, that might help.
Yeah, I think I have the exact part you were quoting from here. It's a relatively short paragraph, but I kind of highlighted it because I loved it. So this is from the 6th of August, 1914. So quote, "From the perspective of literature, my fate is very simple. The penchant for depicting my dreamlike inner life has pushed everything else aside, and all this has atrophied in a terrible way and doesn't cease to atrophy. Nothing else can ever satisfy me. But now my strength for that depiction is quite incalculable. Perhaps it has vanished forever. Perhaps it will come over me again. The circumstances of my life are certainly not favorable to it. Thus I waver, fly incessantly to the peak of the mountain, but can keep myself up there for scarcely a moment. Others waver too, but in lower regions, with stronger powers. If they are in danger of falling, they are caught by the relative who walks beside them for that purpose. I, however, waver up there. It is, alas, not death, but the eternal torments of dying."
Yeah.
Ooh, and it just feels like when you said salvation, he saw it as salvation. I feel like that is quite apt. But there is also this sort of torture thing, right? There's this sort of like, this thing is in his life, and that's it's not like he chose it from his
right. Well, those heights are sort of, it would be salvation if he could be in those heights without wavering, I guess he's not on the small scale, he's not exploiting his full strength on a smaller scale project that wouldn't be salvation, but maybe could be actualizable.
Right.
He's not, what do we call it now? Setting attainable goals or whatever.
Right.
That wasn't Kafka's strength, right?
Right.
Or something that he really explored in his fiction. When there are goals in his fiction, they're always unattainable. I'm sorry, I don't know if this vacuuming is going to get.
Oh no, we can only. That's totally fine. No worries.
I'm in my office later hour.
That's all right.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's as it should be. Yeah,
right.
The set and setting here. The great film Brazil, the Terry Gilliam film. That is so. I love that film too. It's wonderful. It's so clearly influenced by Kafka.
Yeah. He even has this duo that resembles the assistants that come into the apartment. They're doing like duct work or something. One of them's really tall and one is short. And in the castle, the assistants also change height. Yeah.
Have you seen the Haneke adaptation of the Castle? Where
I had in mind to watch a lot of the adaptations. I read a great book called Kafka Translated by Michelle Woods that also deals with adaptations, film adaptations. She's really exploring all the different ways Kafka sort of reinvented, and it's a great book. Anyways, that gave me the idea of watching. But you want to say something about it?
Yeah, no, not at all. I really admire Haneke as a director and his adaptation of The Castle. I don't think I'm giving away the ending, but it quite literally just ends where the novel ends. It doesn't try to. I just think that move is so exciting. Yeah, worth watching.
Orson Welles, The Trial was showing right here very recently, and I missed it. And I had every intention of seeing it. It had just been restored, I think. But yeah, I haven't gone back and done that as much as I would like to.
That Orson Welles adaptation, I don't know about I don't think seen this restored version, but the version I have seen is excellent. Orson Welles takes a couple creative liberties with it, but I think they're carefully done. To me, it works. It's quite and it's Orson Welles' favorite film of his own.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So it's quite interesting. It's quite well done.
I prefer his ads or his ad reads personally.
Orson Welles.
Yeah.
About peas.
The French. You familiar with these, Ross? There's some really wonderful. This is a tangent, but if there's some very funny, look up Orson Welles voiceover excerpts. He takes umbrage at being directed.
Yeah,
things
he got Orson Welles got a little hard up towards the end, and he had to do some things he would have rather not have done for money.
Yeah,
and the results are pretty funny.
This is a bit of a personal question, but it's also professional. Ross, where did you wo hast du Deutsch gelernt? Where did you pick up your German? Yeah.
I took it in college, actually, initially. So junior year of college, I went to Prague for 1 semester, which is not German speaking. I mean, in Kafka's lifetime, there was a big German speaking part of Prague. That's not the case now. But I was there somewhat in the footsteps of Kafka. You know, my attraction to Prague has a lot to do with Kafka. Not only to do with Kafka, but and that's when I began learning German while I was there, and then also because I was in Prague, I was visiting German-speaking places on, day trips and on breaks and so on. And then when I came back to college, I had kind of finished everything else I needed to finish for my major, and took a lot of German in anticipation of going to Berlin the year after college, which I knew I wanted to do after I visited junior year. I knew I wanted to go back, and I was applying for fellowships and ways of getting to Berlin, and luckily got one and went there for a year after college. So I spent that senior year of college really immersed in learning German, and kind of really obsessed with learning German. Like I remember I jumped from, having taken some beginning courses to a seminar where we were reading Freud. And just because I was willing to sit there with the text and look up every single word and look up whatever was happening in the sentence, and sort of, precursor to translation, like really decoding a language that at the time I had no access to until I decoded it. And then, I gained a lot of knowledge that way. I wrote a senior thesis on a German language poet, Paul Celan. And dealt with the originals of his texts as in a sort of academic way, where and then when I got to Berlin, I had all this latent knowledge, but a lot of it was not applicable to daily life.
Right. Yeah,
sure.
Freud doesn't.
Yeah, it's like I had to talk to the plumber, but I was talking like a 19th century German novel or whatever. So that was a great moment of kind of finding my way into the actual living contemporary language. And, I never even knew I wanted to do that. When I started with German, I thought it was just to be able to read these authors that I so loved in the original, which is also, I've thought about this, that there's a slight irony to my craving for the originals coming back around to me, becoming a translator myself, and not really having that same valorization of the original as I did at the time, where I thought, I kind of fell into that myth, like you have to read them in the original. And then, what I found was, yes, I discovered things in the original that then I wanted to translate into English and continue that process. But in any case, it was it's probably even before I went there, but when I started to interact with the language as a learner, then it just took, like, it just became a language that fascinated me and that appealed to the way my mind works, or the way I like to express myself. And then I had a much broader interest in the language than just like being able to read Nietzsche or whatever. I got a chance to explore that when I lived there, and had to use it in all different facets of life. And that's when I became aware of more contemporary German literature too, and just what was happening in Germany now, as opposed to in Thomas Mann's time or whatever.
Right. What is...
and not just Germany, by the way, German-speaking world.
German-speaking, right. What is...
can't forget the Swiss.
Right.
Oh, yeah. No. My interest really is for German language literature. Even anytime somebody is about to publish my bio and it says, a translator of German literature, I always ask, is there room to add the word language of German language literature? Because I know German means the language, but it could sound like it's just the country.
Right, from the country, right.
Austrian literature and Swiss literature, and there's plenty of German-speaking writers who lived in Romania, or like Kafka in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire.
One more question along these lines before. Did you have a second language before learning German? Or was this your first?
Way. I had taken one in school. So I'd taken French for 6 years. And even when I first got to college and there was a language requirement, I thought, well, I could take French. So I took another French course at the level I was at. And I can still use French to look at the French translations of, say, Kafka's Diaries, and see what they did. And I recently got a couple volumes in French, and I'm not sure whether I'll be able to just read them straight off the page or whether it'll be an arduous process because I haven't just tried to read in French in a long time.
Well, I'm just gonna.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say this is just complimentary. That is an incredible feat to pick it up in university and to go and live there, and then to end up becoming a translator. Very serious accomplishment. Very cool. You must have become obsessed, like you said.
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to say, like, it didn't feel like so much. I mean, it was a great effort in that I like strenuously applied myself to learning it, but it was like an addiction, like the way you would strenuously apply yourself to like winning a video game or something.
Right.
Like I just wanted to do it. So it didn't feel like a great peak to scale or something. I was just endlessly fascinated with like, oh, what else can you do? Oh, you can do that in German. I want to be able to do that with my sentence.
I think it's a beautiful language. I think it gets a bad rap. I don't think I need to sell that to you. Do you have a favorite? Well, yeah, right. Indeed. What do you have a favorite German word?
I do, actually. I forgot I did. It's the word shonen. Do you know it?
Shonen, SCHONEN, or
yeah. So
no.
To shonen something is to kind of preserve it to keep it well preserved. Like, oh, don't put your coffee mug down on the coffee table. We have to, keep it from getting damaged or keep it, in good condition. That would be one use of shonen. But what I love about the word is its semantic range. So it also means something like sparing, like verschonen. Like if you're verschont after an accident or disaster, you've been spared by the disaster. So what shonen includes that I love that makes it a word that I find really poetic and beautiful is that it includes this sense of kind of inevitable decay and destruction. Like you're not protecting something in the sense that you would completely save it, even though it kind of means saving too, or salvaging. You're just doing your best to sort of stave off the inevitable destruction. And, the way that, like, of course, a coffee table is going to have ordinary wear and tear, but you put a coaster on it for shonen.
Right, shonen.
So it's this concern for things that, like, you wouldn't just be careless with the things around you and just destroy them, willy-nilly. Yeah. But you would take care to kind of, and it can be translated as taking care. Like when it says, fragile, handle with care. That's kind of shonen. Like, I think Kafka says at some point his father reproaches him for his own anger toward his father because his father has to be geschont, like he has to be handled with care because he's been anxious and he's weak and he's aging or whatever.
Interesting.
Fascinating. Yes. Wunderbar. And it's so good. You didn't give the answer like, oh, I like Gemütlichkeit or I like Schadenfreude or whatever. That's a heavy answer. I'm gonna look that up after this episode. I like very cool.
Variations of it like verschont and other ones I'm not thinking of, like like Schonung, or like it could be an act of consideration too, like to spare someone's feelings.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's such a malleable, interesting language. It's a lot of depth in German.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if Heidegger uses the word shonen. I think because he often talks about care, Sorgen, and not that we should get into Heidegger.
Sorry, it's a different episode. Right. In 10 years when you translate some Heidegger.
Yeah.
I do have one thing, and I hope this isn't too much of a sidetrack, because I love the Blue Octavo notebooks.
Yeah.
And I feel like no one really ever talks about them. I think partially because they're sort of odd. Like in terms of where do you fit them, they're not really stories, and I know that those were written during the same time as these diaries.
Even in a kind of gap, There's a kind of gap in the diaries when he started using those notebooks.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. So he sort of moved over to the Blue Octavo notebooks, and then at some point kind of decided he wasn't working in those anymore and came back to the diaries.
Which I think were like brown quarto notebooks or something. Okay. Because in German you use these colors and sizes. Like we don't actually, as far as I know, maybe somewhere in the UK, I don't think we really use these in English other than when we talk about German work.
Yeah. And there's something about brown quarto doesn't have the same ring to it as Blue Octavo for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I'm correct. This is something that happens to me a lot in these types of conversations, because in fact I'm not a Kafka specialist. I just spent a lot of time reading this stuff.
Right.
But I get things wrong, and like there's always something afterwards. I look back at the conversation, I'm like, oh man. There's one where I described a guy who was I think he was Jewish. He was like a self-hating Jew, right? And I was talking about some obscure German. He's just a German anti-Semite,
Yeah.
Some obscure figure that I described as a self-hating Jew. And I was like,
oh boy.
Yeah, you were you were almost right, but
yeah.
You missed the critical
piece. One himself.
Right.
I tend to get some things wrong, but anyway, the diaries were certainly not Blue Octavo. These diaries. So the Blue Octavo notebooks. I mean, he didn't call them like these notebooks. He referred to in the notebooks themselves. He refers to them as his diaries, right? He says like starting a new diary, or these diaries are this or that, or I'm going to give I just handed the diaries over to Milena, because at some point he gave them to Milena, and all the pages in that notebook he ripped out, and then in the next entry, which was continued in the rest of that notebook, where he finished the diaries, he said, I just gave all of the diaries to Milena. So those were the materials that we know he called his diaries and thought of as diaries and referred to as diaries, where there's hard evidence. And then the Blue Octavo notebooks and some other papers and so on, he ends up treating somewhat the same way. Like just as the diaries, he doesn't keep strictly to a diaristic mode of writing. He also writes stories in them, or drafts letters in them, or draws in them. He tended to use whatever writing material was at hand to do whatever writing he was moved to do. So in some other notebooks and papers, he'll write what are sort of indistinguishable from the entries in his diaries in their format and their content. But he didn't call those diaries per se. So there's definitely a blurriness to the designations, and they were, decided after his death what would be published as diaries, what would be published as the Blue Octavo notebooks, or as in the new edition, it's just there are several volumes of posthumous writings, Nachbelass and Schriften, that are, I think they're chronological, but they're not based on, notebook type or whatever.
Right.
And those are separate from what are published as the diaries.
That's interesting. So I had never been quite clear if the Blue Octavo stuff, and I'm not expecting you to have spent nearly as much time with that as the book you translated, but I never understood, like, was this and I guess you sort of answered that question. Then fundamentally it's blurry. Like, was this a special project? Because there is like this thematic coherence to
there's something different about it.
Yeah.
It's more like aphorisms, right?
Yeah.
He's philosophical. So
and you do see some of that in the diaries, but not in the sort of focused manner where it's like one after another.
I think most of it comes after the Blue Octavo notebooks, when he goes back to the diaries. Then he writes some more. He writes a series of aphorisms in the diaries that have some things in common. After it, so it's like between 1917 and, again, I could get this slightly wrong, but it's between 1917 and sometime in the maybe 1919 or 1920. And he's writing these Blue Octavo notebooks, and he's writing these kind of more aphoristic, philosophical, condensed, right? Because we think of Kafka as at once like somebody who writes really long, complex sentences, and he's a master of brevity, right? He can write these, a cage goes in search of a bird or whatever. These one-liners, or these really short, puzzling stories that are almost riddles, so he definitely was experimenting with another form, but then you see him in those 1920 or 22 entries, in those later entries in these diaries. In my translation, you see him using that form later on as well.
He wouldn't be the first writer to sort of discover or cultivate a skill for the aphorism and then become slightly addicted to it. Like, we did an episode on Chiron, and he was sort of the same way. Once he discovered he could write basically bullet points, it was like all over for him. So that's interesting. And it is a certain kind of skill. I don't know that everybody can do that, right? Very sort of pithy, interesting, enigmatic, one or two sentences at a time. Yeah.
Right. And enigmatic is a key word for Kafka, because they're particularly enigmatic. Like his aphorisms, they don't usually amount to. In fact, a cage goes in search of a bird was maybe a bit of a misleading one to say. It's just easy to remember.
Right.
If hopefully I'm quoting it right, but it's
that sounds right.
It's easy to remember, but it's actually one that's a lot more. I mean, it's got a lot of multivalence, but many of them are much more baffling than that.
Yeah.
So, but the question of the status of different writings, of course, is in a way circular. It leads us back to the fact that this was all just a mass of materials he never intended for publication, and this was just all different sorts of writing that was scattered all around. And I think, in addition, that kind of draws attention to that is something I value. That reminds us that this is that's what this was, and that now we have access to it, and there's so much richness in it. But it's important to remember that in a way that these aren't finished works, and that these are showing us a process, and sort of open-ended process of experimentation and self-revision. And for me, that's where a lot of the interest and the appeal of it lies too. That may be for some a matter of taste, of course.
Yeah.
So making these really sharp distinctions probably isn't that great an idea. But there is certainly some justification for publishing these as the diaries, and then leaving other posthumous writings in some other form. Certainly, you can do anything with selections from this material, and there are many great collections that just kind of are selections from the unpublished writing, and they can include a great letter, a great diary entry, a great series of aphorisms.
There's a certain logic to that too. I'm sure you could, there could be a Kafka on fill in the blank, and it could be just a drawing together of various, bits that he has on a subject. But I mean, we're kind of winding down here. I do just want to reiterate like how exciting this book is. I read the intro, and when you're sort of describing your philosophy about this, your approach, I mean, it's no secret for our audience, but I'm a writer too. Kevin's a writer. I have notebooks. Kevin, when you publish my diaries, please lean a little on the Max Brode side. Take some things out.
We all want
it's all staying in, Brad. It's all staying in. I might even embellish a little bit.
Right.
But I'll do it. I'll do it.
My best friend.
Yes, the sturdiest friend I ever had. It'll all be in German, and we'll have to hire Ross. Yeah, somebody will have to hire Ross to translate me.
But I just like I'm saying, I want to just reiterate that this really does. I mean, we're never going to be able to be inside Kafka's head entirely. And this is, I think, as close as we're ever going to get. And I'm just so impressed with what you've done here, and the sort of courage to say no, it all goes in like that. That's impressive.
There were times where that took a little courage, where I was. I mean, I call it courage, but it felt like fear. There were times where it was scary to leave in things that I thought, well, I'm just going to get blamed for making a mistake here, making a mess of something. But so it is actually not so much courage as fear. Yeah,
right.
It's a scary process. I'm just glad that other people find it appealing the way I did. I do.
Yeah. It's a very exciting volume. Please buy it. It's the F. Kafka Diaries, the Franz Kafka Diaries, translated by Ross Benjamin. And we're going to come back and talk for another, I think, 30 minutes at this rate. I feel like we're just getting started. For Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Brad, thanks for arranging this. Ross, thanks for your time. We'll keep going for a little bit longer, but really very impressive work. One quick question before we pause briefly, then come back. When you finished the project, did you celebrate somehow?
This kind of sound too Kafka-like, but it's really hard to pinpoint when it's finished. Like, when I sent it to my publisher, it wasn't finished. In fact, I had a first publisher. We won't even go into that, but I had to find a new publisher a year later, and that's complicated. All I'll say about it now is that the publisher where it ended up is where it should have begun. It was just sort of a quirk of circumstance that there was ever a different publisher to speak of. But anyway, then there's get it in, but I still have to put the page numbers into the notes or the final, so, and then I'm still working on things when they just yank it out of my hands because it has to go to production. I'm still trying to fix, things and make sure that I've dotted all the I's. And this is just now one extended celebration, I think, because it's once it's out in the world, that's the only way it's really, really finished.
All right. Very good. All right, Ross, where can people find you, your website?
Yeah, Ross M for Meckler, my middle name, rossmbenjamin.com, and similarly Instagram, Twitter.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ross. This has been fantastic.
Thank you both so much.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and my nightmares are going to be about like offending all of the Kafka scholars, and they come to you in your dreams, just sort of.
Welcome to the club.